Joe Volpe, publisher of Corriere Canadese, North America's only Italian language daily, here on behalf of Go Live TV and Corcan Media Group. In this session, we're going to be talking about the free trade agreement, and who best to talk to than the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, Flavio Volpe, the president of that association.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. Now, the public has been following this for quite some time. And the issue of the United States, President Trump, snubbing Canada or keeping us off the table on the negotiations, and now talking only to Mexico, but not to us. Is that a perception, political game, or is it a reality?
The Americans are trying to put maximum pressure on Canada. And so they're saying that they're spending time with Mexico, dealing with issues that are germane only to Canada, to the United States and Mexico.
Like what, for example?
Agriculture, fruit supply, seasonal fruit supply, but also automobiles. They've asked the Mexicans that if they make cars in facilities that pay less than $16 an hour, they'd like to see 40% of that content come from the U.S. or Canada.
But the Mexicans already say that they're meeting that standard.
They meet that number on the average.
So it's the average of all the automotive parts and automobile assembly.
Sure. If you were to speak to my Mexican counterpart, he'd tell you, well, there's 3 or 4 plants there that might be at 20-25%. So if Mexico accepts 40%, they might say, well, we've accepted the average, let's move on. But what they would do to those 3 or 4 plants in those 3 or 4 cities that rely on those massive plants, they'd sign their death warrant.
So in other words, you'd have massive unemployment.
Right. For those towns, that would be the end of it.
But that doesn't pose a threat for Canada. Like if they're at less than 16%, what kind of plants in Canada, or $16 per hour, what kind of plants in Canada can't meet that standard?
Every plant in Canada meets that standard very comfortably. Almost all of them at twice that level. So this isn't an issue for Canada. This is why we're not worried that Canada is not at the table right now with Mexico and the U.S.
So it's not a question of a political snub.
The U.S. this administration has legal authority to negotiate a trilateral. They didn't seek authority from Congress to do a bilateral. It's just a good negotiating tactic, and we fall prey when we wonder whether Canada's getting snubbed and how we should overreact. That's what they're hoping we do. We've been counseling the government to stay calm, get your constant updates, and then when we get back.
In terms of updates, so like there's basically two ministers that should be carrying this ball in cabinet. One is Chrystia Freeland, but she's foreign affairs minister, and the general perception is that she's quite competent. She's listening to everybody. Is she listening to you?
I speak to her quite regularly. She knows the file. She's very active on the file. And I think she's got a very good touch with the Americans and the Mexicans. When you hear that the Americans, there might be some interplay with her and her counterpart that's negative, I think it's her counterpart in both countries sees how strong she is, and they use every tactic that they can to maintain their advantage. So
the perception that she's been, backdooring everybody, and the Americans in particular, that she's going to Congress, the senators and congressmen and women, behind the back of the administration, that's all nonsense.
Well, I mean, nothing's behind the back. They're just down the same street. And frankly, all industries, not just ours, have demanded that of her. And we're very happy that she's done it. This is an administration that has done many crazy things. They're caging children at the border. To ascribe a sophistication to the way that they're negotiating would be false. So the fact that she's going to all the angles, the authority to negotiate a trade agreement is congressional. The authority to pass a Nafta 2.0 is congressional. I'm glad that she's there.
Well, so the other minister is the minister responsible for industry. Mm-hmm. The Canadian minister, that would be Nav Bains. One never hears his name in any of these discussions. Has he been sidelined just like the Minister for International Trade, or are they focusing all their attention through Chrystia Freeland?
I spoke to him on Friday, and we speak on a regular basis as well. He's making sure, at least in the auto business, to make sure that we're happy with where the terms are. And his department has been the department largely responsible for informing the negotiating table. She's the public face, so I wouldn't expect him to be there. But I mean, originally when Francois Philippe Champagne was the trade minister, I think it was this government, this Prime Minister's office, prudently figured out that that would be the wrong guy to negotiate, and they asked Chrystia Freeland to do it.
So, you're talking about some of the issues. The issues are Canadian content.
Yeah.
So what's at stake? Because that number seems to change all the time. So cars and parts go back and forth across the border, primarily the border between Windsor and Detroit, and secondarily between, I guess you'd say, Niagara Falls and Buffalo or Fort Erie. So what's the issue? What's the Canadian content component that's such a stickler?
It's a North American content. The Americans would like to see the number go from 62.5% to 75%. They'd like the way that you calculate that is there's 29 parts component categories, and you have to be compliant on those. The Americans would like to expand that list, possibly to double.
So you could from 29 to 58.
We're negotiating. They would like to track the origination of the steel and the aluminum in the major parts. So right now they've proposed 70% North American steel and aluminum. There isn't a country-specific requirement. At the beginning of these negotiations, the Americans said 85% and 50% has to come from the U.S. The industry in all three countries immediately repelled that. Canada and Mexico immediately pointed out that the Americans are hurting the American car makers in those two countries to start with, so they backed off that.
Well, how much, let me interrupt you for a second, how much of that, of the steel and aluminum is Canadian in that North American content?
The vast majority of steel in Canadian automotive parts production comes from Canada or from the Great Lakes region. Canadian...
The Great Lakes includes, of course, the southern part of that border.
That's right.
Okay.
Look, steel is a very, very logistically difficult raw material to move. So if you're going to build cars at an efficient price, you're going to source your steel close by. And for parts makers, we don't buy our steel. The automakers negotiate a group deal, and we pass through that price. And so they get big orders that are guaranteed to big places like ArcelorMittal, Dofasco, and Hamilton. And it underpins the Hamilton economy, and it does very well for the other Ontario towns that are making cars.
And the aluminum comes out of Quebec.
Aluminum is almost all out of Quebec, and a very healthy, very competitive aluminum business.
But there's no auto industry in Quebec.
No, but the margins on aluminum are good enough that if they're going to have to send them down the highway, you can afford it.
So we've followed some of this, sure. And the aluminum manufacturers, the secondary downstream manufacturers, are all complaining that they can't afford to abide by the requests of the Americans, especially if they put, as they say, tariffs on aluminum.
Sure, that's a separate issue. So the Americans, while we're waiting to close the Nafta, have threatened 10% tariff on any import of aluminum from around the world, and initially gave Canada an exemption and Mexico an exemption. They weren't satisfied with how quickly the Nafta talks were moving, although they were being the problem. And so they said, well, while we're waiting, you have a 10% tariff. Of course, Canada has responded in kind, and so we have a problem there. What we've done is we've just raised the price of aluminum domestically and for the import market on both sides of the border. I'm confident that we'll get through that if we pass the Nafta in the next month or so, we'll get that exemption again.
So we've taken a look, and you'll see some of the images, of course, that we've got pretty high-tech material and usable material and product coming out of southern Ontario primarily. And one of the issues has been not so much that these things keep going back and forth. I think you gave us an indication that typically an automobile that's manufactured on this side of the border has essentially seen 3 or 4
in some
crossings.
cases up to 7 times a part will cross the border before it ends up in a consumer's hand.
And so these costs are going to obviously be passed on to the end consumer. They're not going to be passed on to somebody who's here.
That's right.
And that end consumer is in the United States.
That's right.
So
mostly. We
produce, just under 3 million cars?
That's right, 2.5.
2.5, and just under 2 of them go down to the United States.
That's right.
It doesn't sound like a logical idea that what happens is you would inflict damage on yourself.
Well, what we've been saying to the Americans is that if you put a tariff, it's really just a tax on your own consumer. And a tax on your own consumer to pay on vehicles made by your companies with your raw materials and parts, it doesn't make sense at all. But I think they know that. I think it's a pressure tactic on Nafta to get concessions in other sectors. Other
like
sectors.
what? Which sector?
Well, we see the president spending a lot of time talking about dairy, and talking about eggs.
Yeah.
And he quotes a tariff. Everybody thinks that in NAFTA there's no tariffs, but in the supply managed agriculture sectors, there are quotas, and if you exceed the quotas, there are tariffs designed to keep that market tight and protected.
So it's primarily the milk and the cheese market.
That's right.
So in that milk and the cheese market, you're really talking about a different type of industry. You're not talking about, as we see over here, 4 wheels. You're actually talking about 4 legs.
Right.
It's the animal primary industry. So is this a false equivalency where we're talking about the Americans want to match up modern post-industrial technology and play that against 19th century technology?
Votes in Wisconsin count to this administration and this president, just like votes in Quebec count to this government. But frankly, there is no equivalency between an added value 21st century connected, autonomous, free driving vehicles and the kinds of industries that helped build this country, but we left them behind 100 years ago. What happens in these trade negotiations? Typically for Canada, the TPP in Korea.
The TPP, let's just stop for a second for our viewers here. It's the
Trans-Pacific Partnership with Japan ostensibly, but also Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and Singapore and New Zealand and Australia.
But that's a trade initiative that was initially abandoned in part because, well, Canada wasn't really a part of it.
That's right.
And President Trump, before he was president, didn't want to have anything to do with it because it was seen as a backdoor way of getting Chinese, Vietnamese, and Malaysian products through Japan into North America.
It lowered the cost to qualify as a product that didn't carry tariffs. In exchange, so we lowered the content levels. In exchange, we got access to our markets for beef and pork and dairy and eggs. So what happened is the Japanese got access, or getting access, the Koreans got access through Canada, Korea, to the sophisticated marketplace, the North American marketplace that buys vehicles, $30,000 products packed with 16 million lines of code. A typical car has more lines of code than a typical airliner. In exchange, we thought that it was prudent. We give away some of those protections in that market share for share of our products that grow on 4 legs.
Excuse me for being a little cynical, but if you're from an urban environment like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or name any other city, it doesn't seem to be a very strategic trade-off. I mean, 85% of the population lives in large urban centers. Sure. So, what's the value of that supply management?
Well, there's a quota, and
so what's the value of that
quota? The quota is probably worth $40 or $50 billion. So that's the
asset.
That's the cows and the chickens.
Okay.
And when we negotiated the TPP with the Americans, originally they had demanded that we abandon 10% of that market, and the previous government said, well, that's worth about $4 billion, and we established a price. So we need to, in the public debate, we need to understand that this isn't principle, there's a price.
So, but that's the American approach. So if the price is $4 billion, so you would say, you give up that $4 billion, then we'll make a concession of $4 billion on the high-tech side. Is that what essentially
Maybe
the
point is these are the pressures that trading partners put in a negotiation. With respect to this government and even the previous one, you also have to take a look at who votes for you and all of that. Every vote is equal in this country, of course, and just like the other one. But if you're building an economy of the future, if all of your government programming is innovation, of course you have to manage the industries that are traditional. But if you're going to bet the house like the Japanese do, like the Koreans do, like the Americans do, you bet the house where technology is going.
So what's the value of the asset on that technology that you're talking about?
Do you know Canada exports $85 billion worth of automotive goods every year? The asset value of the investments that are sitting here in market, the replacement value, are somewhere approaching $100 billion. If you buy out quota on a dairy farm, that dairy farmer gets the cost of the value of the current quota, but still produce milk. If you lose an auto assembly plant from a town just north of Toronto or just east of Windsor, it's gone forever.
So it's a trade-off of principle or price.
You have to decide whether you're going to put a line in the sand on principle, or you're going to price things out.
So the principle so far is you either high tech or, become a supplier of primary product.
Well, I think what Canada has established in its negotiating history over the last 30 years of free trade negotiations is that we always have a price. Now, in politics, we stand on principle. In negotiation, we go to price. In TPP negotiations, we priced out automotive. We said we'll lower the content levels, we'll change the definitions, and then we priced out supply management and other agricultural products. We'd get rid of 10% of the market. We'd give $4 billion.
But we didn't really lower the content level. We actually, and the Americans want to raise the content level resident in North America.
Well, in every other trade negotiation, we've gone downward. In this one here, the Americans are pulling us upward. And frankly, that principle and that price is supported by the Canadian auto sector, the American auto sector, and the Mexican auto sector. For the first time, it appears that the driver here is this administration, and in fairness to Canada and Mexico, these two administrations understand that the value of future investments in automotive, of related machine, tool, die, mold businesses, related information technology, intelligent infrastructure, cars that talk to each other, that see each other, is the wave of the future. It is what future wealth is going to be based on for generations that are going through school right now.
So the old concept of having either a Fortress Europe, Fortress Asia, and Fortress Canada, or Fortress North America, is one that everybody has bought into as a question of principle.
That's right.
That's what you're telling me. That's what I'm hearing. So the industry, the auto industry, and all its related ramification supply chains, they're all in favor of this. Because if all three countries are in agreement, then and the industry resident in all three countries are in agreement, then you don't have a problem from cheap imports.
That's right. If you create the right conditions to protect North America, we have enough. We make 17 million cars in the region. We buy 20 million cars in the region. It's the customer with the highest disposable income around the world. Everybody wants in. If you lower the cost, which we've done over the years, tutti fuori.
Everybody out.
Everybody out. If you raise the price and do business within this territory, but get everybody the right. If you invest $2 billion in a plant and in the supply chain, you have the right to sell to the consumer at the same cost as everybody else. Everybody in North America wins.
So, for example, when we're talking about everybody in North America wins and every place else might lose or might not lose, we had a situation not that long ago where Japanese automakers, and to a lesser extent the Korean automakers, had to invest in Canada.
That's right.
Because they needed to get into that market. Because it's too expensive to transport a finished vehicle from there to here, and it costs too much in terms of tariffs. Was that basic idea?
Yes, especially if you're in that lower segment of the market, entry-level cars.
Right.
The margins get eaten up on the ship that crosses the Pacific.
So it doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense.
So you have to export some of your domestic jobs in order to get some profit as a company. And
then with that profit, Toyota's done it very successfully. So does Honda. Hyundai started in Montreal and failed in Montreal, but it's done very well in Georgia. You make money in this market, you repatriate that money. Either you do some R&D here, or you repatriate it to your home country and you put together a competitive product. And the American consumer and the Canadian consumer provide a healthy profit margin that is not accessible anywhere else in the world except for maybe your home market in Japan and maybe in Western Europe. And so it is the prize for automakers. Why lower the price?
So, where are we going with this? Is there going to be a NAFTA agreement signed soon? I mean, we've got a change in administration in Mexico. What's the story with them? Are they in sync with what was on the table before?
I think that we'll see through the course of September, before the American midterms, a very good chance, better than 50%, that we will resolve NAFTA. We'll have a NAFTA 2.0 that'll go to the 3 countries for ratification. If we don't by the end of September, then we'll see a real serious pause for the American midterms. If the Republicans lose the House, so if the Democrats gain the majority in that House, the idea that a NAFTA 2.0 would get passed in that House gets reduced, and they'll be consumed with other constitutional affairs. I'm not sure we come back to the table.
Well, but Canada's entering with the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday that he's actually going to seek re-election. There's an indication that the election has started as of yesterday. The implications for us are more or less the same, are they not?
I think so.
So everybody's going to be working to try to get this done before the end of November.
I think we might see it before the end of September.
Okay, well, we'll hold you to it, and when it happens, you're going to join us again.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Flavio Volpe, president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada, and on NAFTA, thank you for your insights. This is Joe Volpe on behalf of Corriere Canadese, Go Live TV, and Corriere Media Group, thanking you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you once again. Thank you.